Right then, friends, we are to hear this morning what I think is going to be a very interesting talk by Rosie about why I am not a Roman anymore, which is an intriguing title. And so, Rosalie, when you are ready, could you please start?
Okay, friends, can I suggest we all mute ourselves, apart from me, of course, and if we just have a moment or two of quiet, and then I'll begin. Thank you, friends. I don't want to keep you in quiet too long because I'm afraid there's some building going on out the back, and it can be heard anywhere in my house, so I hope I can out-talk it. Okay, so the title of my talk is Why I Am No Longer a Holy Roman, ? And that question mark is important, and I will come to that later on. But the Holy Roman bit, this has come about because I am married to a priest in the Church of England. And when I used to introduce myself to his friends or whatever, or we had occasion to speak about our different faiths and religions, I would always say, I'm a Catholic. And Michael would say, Catholic means worldwide and universal, but you're a Roman Catholic, in other words, of the Roman Church. So it wasn't until I moved into his circles that I had any need to make that extra distinction. So to understand how I've got to where I am now, I'd like to take you through some of my background. I'm Irish, you'll have guessed, and was brought up as a Roman Catholic in Dublin. We moved there when I was 3, and my mother was a very devout Catholic. There was no question. It was, go to Mass every Sunday, and if there was a midweek Mass, she would be there too. I never saw my dad at Mass. He moved to England when I was about 8 to find work, and then he came home a couple of times a year. So we didn't see a lot of him, but when he was home, he certainly never went to Mass. But my mum, Lord rest her soul, as we would say, made up for his absence. So Mass was the big thing for us as Roman Catholics. And I was the eldest of 5, and so Sunday morning would see my mum marching us all out the door down to church. And in the early days, it was Latin Mass. And I must say, I found that kind of magical, this, Latin Mass. I love the incense and the bells and the Latin hymns, which I didn't understand. But the thing for children when they went to Mass was that they were given a set of rosary beads to try and keep them from fidgeting and to keep them quiet. And here is I don't know if you can see those, a pair of rosary beads. And these are a black pair, which I bought in Bristol at the cathedral, believe it or not. But when I was a child, our color choices were pink, blue, and white. And so we even had the stereotyping that the girls got the pink rosary beads. And so we were expected to say the rosary 10 Hail Marys, Our Father, and so on, to keep us quiet. And if you got a bit bored with your rosary beads, you then could look around the church at all the various statues. We had St. Joseph, Child of Prague, St. Martin de Porres, the Sacred Heart with the big heart on fire in the middle of his chest, and the Virgin Mary. We also had the Stations of the Cross. Again, you could look at them while you were at Mass, and there were occasions when you could actually do the Station of the Cross. So you would stand in front and say a series of prayers and move on to the next. We were certainly never encouraged to read the Bible or have any sort of scholarly exploration of our faith. That was all seen as being left to the priests. They were in charge, and that was their domain. Now, to become a Catholic, I was baptized as a baby, and this was always considered very important. You were baptized in the hospital if necessary, as close to as when you were born as possible. In some cases, you had to wait till you came back to your own area and you were baptized at Mass. There were lots of other rituals that helped to develop my Catholic faith. We used to have retreats. These were non-residential. We would have foreign missionaries come to visit and they would give sermons. We were encouraged to do novenas. Now, these were quite interesting. They were often novenas to particular saints, and you might follow a series of prayers for 9 days. And in doing so, you gained what were known as plenary indulgences. And these were very important because if you died in a state of sin, these plenary indulgences could help you move out of purgatory into heaven, rather than remain in limbo forever. So anything you could do to build up your stash of plenary indulgences was important. I remember one time referring to them as being like green shield stamps. You know, you gathered as many as you could and hoped to get a prize at the end. My Catholicism was also supported within my education. I was taught by nuns, Sisters of Charity, and they were a very good working order. They were teachers, they worked in hospitals, they obviously prayed for everybody, and some of them went on as missionaries, went abroad. And besides teaching us to read and write and so on, they were also entrusted with the job of preparing us for our first Holy Communion at the age of 7. And for a lot of us, of course, it was supposed to be about rehearsing how to take the Holy Communion host and learning your prayers and your catechism. But for a lot of us, it was about the little white dress we got to wear. And I remember my dress was provided by the nuns, but my mother knit my cardigan, and she also knit my knee-high lace socks in 3-ply wool. And I thought I was only gorgeous. I can still in my mind see the photograph of my first Holy Communion. The heavens opened, and in my photograph, I looked like I'm standing on a pond. It was so wet. Then at 14, I was confirmed. And the thinking there was that you were slightly older and able to make a more informed consent. But actually, when I look back, I thought, well, consent, it was just rubber stamping that which had been given to me. I didn't feel I had anything to compare it to. And in fact, there was a hymn we used to sing at that time, that we were soldiers in Christ's army. Confirmation made me so. So as I say, the nuns played their part in keeping us within the Catholic faith. In fact, they nearly did such a good job that I almost became a nun myself. I was in secondary school one day and Sister Lucy called my name over the intercom, and I thought, oops, I must be in trouble. So off I went to the office, and I had just turned 15 and my father had died. And she started talking to me, and I couldn't quite, well, I was expecting to be told off about something, but I couldn't quite work out. And then it dawned on me. She asked me if I had the call. And I thought, the call, sister? And she said, yes, I've been observing you, and I'm wondering if you feel you've had the call to become a nun. So I immediately burst into tears. I said, oh, sister, I'm the eldest of 5 children. My mother's a widow. I couldn't possibly join the nuns. I have to look after the family and blah, blah, blah. So I was convinced that maybe she'd had the call on my behalf and that I had no choice but to go forth. Anyway, I was spared that. We also were encouraged to consolidate our Catholicism by doing good works. And in our parish, one of the priests set up something called the Peace Corps. And this was borrowing the American idea of tapping the talents of young people for the good of their community. So we did all sorts of things like digging gardens for the elderly and chopping wood and so on. And while I was in the Peace Corps, a group of us went on a work camp to the Glen Cree Reconciliation Centre in the Wicklow Mountain. And we did building and digging and all sorts there, and also had a fantastic time. But it was there that I met the youth worker from the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland. This was the Peace and Reconciliation Centre. And boy, did that challenge and open my mind that there was something else in the world available other than Catholicism. I began to meet people from all faiths and none. And I also had an up-close experience of these Protestants that I used to hear about. But in Holy Catholic Dublin, I hadn't met any at that stage. And in fact, the only reference to Protestants I'd had growing up was my mother was from Northern Ireland. And she used to talk about, she was raised on a farm, that their neighbours were Protestants and how that they all worked together and helped each other save the harvest and so on. And this, of course, was in contrast to the political unrest and so on that was happening in Northern Ireland. While I was at Corrymeela, I eventually had my social work training and I became a member of the Corrymeela community. But I was struck by the great pain that was felt at community weekends because we usually had a mass at the Corrymeela Centre, and we also had a Protestant service. And as I said, there was great pain felt. You really felt the difference and the otherness when some Catholics were adamant that Protestants couldn't come and receive Holy Communion because they didn't believe in transubstantiation, the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And it was also at Corrymeela I began to recognise the difference between religion and faith. If you like, from any religion was the kind of club you belonged to, a particular version. But if we supposedly shared the Christian faith, regardless of what title we took. Sadly, in Northern Ireland, of course, the faith labels or religious labels also equated to political labels. So a person might say they were a Protestant even if they never set foot in a church, because it also showed their political affiliation. But I'm happy to say, in having my mind opened and broadened and beginning to question all that I had learned, believed and grown up with, I met some Quakers. Some of you will know Diana and John Lampin, and they lived and worked in Derry and worked across the divide with Protestant and Catholics. They also helped out in the summer camps at the Corrymeela Centre, bringing people together. And the other very striking couple I met were Peter and Valerie Tennant. They were originally from Scotland and had moved to Ballycastle. And Peter was just the quiet man personified. And one of his good works, if you like, or quiet things he did for the Corrymeela Centre was plant lots and lots of trees around the edge, because Corrymeela was on a cliff looking out to sea and was very windswept. But he also quietly worked away at political levels and with the police and so on. And when I trained as a social worker, he invited me he put my name forward as an independent visitor to police stations. And I felt really honoured to be asked to do that. But again, it was making sure that people's rights were observed. And as I say, when they went into the police station, they were often held overnight for questioning until they could go to court the next day. So as I say, that was my first encounter with Quakers, and very impressive. Very impressed I was with them. So in and around that time, there were all sorts of things happening in the Catholic Church that I was questioning. There was the whole question around abortion and contraception. In the 70s and so on, if you wanted contraception, condoms or whatever, you had to take the train to Belfast. And there was all this sort of smuggling going on. And it seemed to me very strange that the Catholic Church didn't want you to become pregnant outside of wedlock, but they certainly, other than abstinence, weren't offering you any preventative measures, let's say. And also I was shocked and horrified that young girls who did find themselves pregnant, if they wanted an abortion, had to travel to England. And I had an occasion to accompany one young girl at the time. And I really, at that point, thought to myself, my soul is damned, because the church certainly wouldn't approve of what I was doing. And of course, we can't ignore all these scandals within the church. Many young mums and their babies went into the Magdalene laundries, were badly treated, their babies were taken from them, and so on. And to my horror, I learned that about sexual abuse. And when I revisited Ballyfermot, where I grew up some years back, I learned that some of the priests we knew growing up were serving time in jail for sexually abusing young boys and so on. But I think back then the church was very powerful. We didn't question their power, and I think children would have obeyed because they didn't know any different. So as I said, and I think the struggle for me at that time was trying to separate the people within the church, so the priests, the nuns and so on, and the actual faith that had come to us from Jesus Christ. I went on then, and my mind broadened, and I married a Protestant, a priest in the Church of England, Michael. Some of you know him. And loved being the vicar's wife. At that time, I was still going to Mass about once a month. And then I realized that this was silly. So I stopped going to Mass and was happy to receive communion in my husband's church, in the Church of England. But I always promised myself, one thing I forgot to say was that while my mother was alive, I always made sure that when I went home to Dublin, I went to Mass, because it was more important to me to please her and not to give her something to worry about. That is the salvation of my soul. I'm sure she prayed mighty hard. Yes, so I think at that stage, I might have described myself as a non-practicing Catholic. And this is where the question mark comes in, because you become a Catholic by baptism, and therefore you're considered to be a member for life. There isn't a kind of easy, signing out and saying I'm no longer a Roman Catholic. So that's what the question mark is about. That certainly in the eyes of the Catholic Church, I'm still one of them, even though I'm non-practicing. And as far as they're concerned, it probably means that I can't receive Holy Communion and I'm not entitled to a Catholic burial, should I have wanted one. Having said that, if I haven't signed myself out, how is anybody going to know? If my body turned up somewhere and my family said, oh, she's Catholic, it wouldn't be questioned. So am I still part Catholic? Question mark. I did then, purely by accident, as I was saying, I promised myself when I retired that I would step back from all that I'd known and do some thinking for myself about my faith journey, where I wanted to be. I saw a sign for the Quakers at Portishead driving past one day, and I thought, oh, I know Quakers. And I went along, was welcomed with open arms, and really felt at home. And it was so lovely that I no longer felt that I had to perform rituals and follow rules in order to belong. I really took to heart the Quaker idea of Quakers think for themselves. And so there are times, I must admit, that I would be envious of people who have a very strong, clear faith in their own minds. And there are days when I'd like it to be black and white and think, oh, I've got to think and work this out for myself. What do I believe? And in fact, when Portishead Quakers had a discussion with the pupils at Gordano School recently, they asked some really challenging questions, and we gave a variety of answers because, as I said, there aren't black and white answers. But I felt certainly becoming a Quaker gave me an opportunity to continue to live out my beliefs and principles in areas like peace and working for equality and so on. Basically, the Quaker testimonies, which I fully embraced. So, yes, so I was reminded of a sort of slight joke that I heard in Belfast many, many years ago. There was a Jewish man walking through the town, and he was stopped and asked whether he was Protestant or Catholic. And he said, I'm neither, I'm a Jew. Yes, but are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew? And so I think sometimes that can apply to Quakerism. Am I a Protestant Quaker or a Catholic Quaker? So I think what I've done is added to my Roman Catholic roots. And I think the next question I'm going to be tackling is, am I a Christian? Because that's the next thing that's coming up. But to help me with that and to slightly finish, I'd like to read from Quaker Faith and Practice. Chapter 2744, I felt spoke to my condition. I personally believe that there is a quality in the bareness of Christian Quakerism. We may act as a bridge between the past and the future, allowing space for friends to dare to search within. To be a Quaker is by no means to say goodbye to myth, ritual, and symbol, but rather to find myself set free to discover them as the very essence of the way I now experience. Quakers are bridge people. I remain on that bridge, part of my roots reaching back into the Christian past and part stretching forward into the future where new symbols are being born. And this was written by Damaris Parker Rhodes in 1985. So friends, that is my story. I can take questions or elaborate.
Thank you, Rosalie. That was enlightening and illuminating. May I add very quickly. The questions, and I can see a number of people here. Hattie, go ahead.
You want me to ask a question?
Well, you put your hand up to ask one.
I don't think I did, but there we go.
Right.
I think I changed it for I was unmuting myself.
Right.
I mean, okay, so the Quaker testimonies, you see, I'm such an amateur Quaker that I don't know what the Quaker testimonies are and where to find them. I haven't even looked online.
Oh.
Right. Sheila.
Sheena's muted.
You're muted, Sheena. That's better.
Do you sometimes still find yourself using your rosary?
No, Sheena, no, I don't. They're like, I suppose they're like a little talisman that remind me of my childhood. In fact, when Michael and I were on sabbatical and we were in Australia, we went into the cathedral there, and I came across a yellow pair and I bought those. And it's more just a kind of memory of the past. But what I do find is, as you can imagine, having, you know, your Catholicism so ingrained, that if I'm caught unawares, I would say things that I used to say, like, oh, in the name of God and all that's good and holy, you know, sort of quick reactions to things that the Catholicism side of me might come forward. And I, you know, remembering things like the grace before meals, or a prayer that I learned at school, which we used to say before communion. So very occasionally in a stressful situation, that might come to my mind. And it's like a little mantra. There's some sort of comfort to be found.
May I have just a quick word to say, it is good to see you're with us, Patsy.
Oh,
Yes, Patsy. Lovely to see you, Patsy.
It gives you a chance to admire my pajamas. Thank you. So sorry.
the reason I asked that question was I bought a rosary many years ago when I was learning about beadwork. And it was then I discovered it wasn't only Roman Catholics who used beads, and they would say their prayers or their meditation. I wouldn't part with my rosary, and that's something. Maybe some of my Church of Scotland past would have said, a rosary? Oh, you couldn't have a rosary. But having learned that you can use it as a form of meditation.
Yes.
Heals the mind.
Yes, you're right, Shane. I think that there are lots of religions who would have beads. And of course, in Greece and places like that, you'll see the men tossing their beads and fingering them as they go through the day.
Carry on, Mary.
Rosaline, could you make some comment about confessions? I remember one of our Quaker friends said when she was a child, she had to make up and pretend she'd been naughty in order to confess. Tell us a bit about confessions.
Yes, and thank you, Mary. That's a really good question. And it also was one of the things I liked about going to Protestant churches, that you didn't have to go to confession. But once you'd made your first Holy Communion, you were expected to go once a week. And it was generally on Saturday, so you were pure and clean and ready for Sunday again. But when we were preparing for our first Holy Communion, they would give you examples like, I've told a lie, or I stole a sweet from a jar, or you know, something along those kind of lines. So I think a lot of children would have gone into confession and repeated those things, even if they didn't do them or weren't quite sure they understood. And then the priest would say, he would, you know, I absolve you from your sin, and go now and say 3 Hail Marys. Or depending on how bad the sin was, you know, if you were guilty of adultery or something more serious, it might be to say a whole rosary, or 10 Hail Marys and 3 Our Fathers, or something like that. Equally, you might have been shouted at and run out of the confession box if your sin was very severe. But I think for a lot of people, it was things like, you know, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 6 weeks since my last confession. So even not going often enough to confession was considered a bit of a sin for people. But the thinking was that you then had a blank, your soul was clean again until you sinned again.
Did you not carry a dread of having defied the church? I mean, this feeling of guilt seems to stay with Roman Catholics.
Oh, absolutely.
In an enduring way.
Yeah, I think I've often wondered if I had stayed living in Dublin and not had the broadening experiences I did by moving away, that I might have been like, I was at a cousin's funeral recently, and she was a very devout Catholic and very involved in her church and so on. But we're from a big family, and speaking to different cousins, this whole question of guilt was still around and very strong. So people would have stopped going to Mass, but would in the next breath say, and I feel very guilty, like something's going to happen to me, or yeah.
Jenny.
Oh, Rosalie, you bring so much memories back to me. My mother was a Roman Catholic, staunch Roman Catholic family, did a lot of work with the Catholics in the East End of London, but she was also friendly with the Jewish community. So she had a mixture of, she had words from Yiddish and had friends that were Jews. So she was a mixture in the beginning. And when they moved to Newbury in Berkshire, her brother was smashed to pieces by a train. And the priest actually said it was because the younger children had failed to go on to the church enough. And the whole family moved away from the Roman Catholic Church and left. But it was never gone. It was always in the family. You could feel it. When my Auntie Peggy was elderly, she wanted to go back to church, but she said she couldn't actually do the sins of 50 years. It was absolutely impossible to cope with. I knew when my father died, my mother wanted me to go to the Church of England to pray for his soul. She was terrified to go into a church that wasn't Catholic. In fact, she did go to his funeral eventually, but you could see that the stamp was there on the family for the rest of their lives, no matter what they did and how they said that they were no longer Catholic. I think so much damage was done in a way, and it's sad because religion's beautiful. And she needed the Quaker friends she had in the village when we grew up. They were wonderful people, and they did actually give her a chance to see that religion could stop being harsh and could be about helping and caring and being involved in communities. But the more you spoke, yes, I remember the rosary. I found it under the stairs. I want to know what it was and what you did with it. And, children are inquisitive, aren't we? But when we buried her, my brother said, "We have just buried a Catholic," and we know it.
Yeah, you reminded me when we did North-South Exchange weekends at Corrymeela, and we had a series of 5 weekends. One was on family, but one of them was on our faith and religion. And the myths and understandings were just shocking, that Catholics definitely wouldn't enter a Protestant church for love nor money, and somehow felt they would be struck down. And the Protestants, I remember one lad saying, "Oh, I've been told if I put holy water on my forehead, I will dissolve," And so there were all sorts of really weird and strange beliefs about how different the other was, whether it was Protestant or Catholic. And if people, because in Northern Ireland, of course, education was segregated as well. and you went to your church and your same faith school, and unless you had opportunity to learn otherwise, you were just fed these myths and had no way of challenging them.
I remember a friend who was with the Quaker Youth Service who went to do, a couple of them went to do some weekends with Catholic and Protestant youth together, children together in the Quaker cottage there. And he said that for the first day or so, they were entrenched in their groups nearly on either side of the room. And slowly, after a little while, they got together and they started to discuss things together. And he said he found that it was more really parental thing rather than child thing. Children were much more happy to discuss and to debate the questions rather than their parents who would sit in their camps and not even discuss anything like that at all. Is this how you would find it?
Yes. Sorry, Mary wanted to. Mary.
What were the reactions of your siblings and other relatives?
It's interesting. As I said, my mother was from Northern Ireland, and so she was one of 12 surviving children. My granny had 15 children, as you can imagine. So we've had lots of aunties, uncles, and cousins. But they were all, of course, Catholic, and living in Northern Ireland would have had their fears and concerns about the other side, about Protestants. And so it was interesting during our summer holidays, Mary, listening to their concerns. Having said that, I found my mother's brothers and sisters very tolerant. They weren't preaching hardline, them and us. They were definitely encouraging us to be good Catholics, but to be neighbourly and friendly and understanding. And that was even when, I can remember being on holiday and the Black and Tans coming in and taking away some local men, and there were roadblocks and all sorts of different things going on. But there was certainly a tolerance, and I think that came from my grandmother, as I said, having brought her children up next door to Protestants and working together across their farms. I think was the root of that. Julia?
Yes, thank you, Rosie. What's your name, Rosie? It's absolutely fascinating for me. I know so little about. I know basic.
I can't hear you, Julia.
Right.
I can't hear you.
Oh, can other people hear me?
Very quiet.
Just
A bit quiet.
Let me see if I can go a bit louder. Hang on.
If you get nearer to the microphone, that would help a lot, I think.
I dare to. I will. Yes. I'm fascinated. Okay. I'm fascinated by all this because I know really very little about Catholicism. I thought I knew the basics, but I never knew, for instance, to what extent you were absolutely in Dublin. At any rate, you were absolutely entrenched in the whole business, and you expected to confess every Saturday before you could go to church on Sunday. That wouldn't have occurred to me. I knew you had to go to church to confession sometimes. I thought that was mostly if you just felt the absolute need that you had to go. The idea that you had to go each time was amazing. And that some people wouldn't even go to other places, into other churches. They were too frightened or whatever. Amazing.
It is interesting about confession that I know there are people who were so worried because even though we lived in a big parish, it felt like the priests knew everybody. And if you were really worried about, your sins were quite serious, you might actually hop on the bus and go to another parish for confession in the hope that the priest wouldn't recognize you. You're so guilty. Val?
Jenny?
Right. Can I come back with a story?
Valerie was trying to speak, but you're muted, Valerie.
You're muted, Val.
Yeah, Valerie first.
You're muted, Valerie. That's better.
Yeah, I'm not muted now.
We can hear you now.
Shall I speak now?
Yes, please.
What I was asking was, Rosie, have you detected much change in the Catholic Church recently? I asked that question because my one-time closest friend, now sadly dead, went to a Catholic school, a boarding school, and she always maintained that the nuns were terrifyingly bad, but they gave her a very good education. But she used to, when her parents drove her from Blackpool to Harrogate to the school, she got to a certain point and she'd start to quake. She was so frightened by it, but they gave her a good education. And I happen to have 2 grandchildren who are being brought up Catholic. And I go along to all the rites of passage, the christenings and so on and so forth. And the one that really horrified me was Ellie's first confession. I guess not confession.
Holy Communion.
That's the one. That's the one.
Yeah.
And she was dressed like a little bride. It was just awful. It was just awful. I keep
terrible.
I never say a word, but I found it absolutely dreadful. So I'm not aware, and she goes to a Catholic girls' school where I presume she's getting a very good education.
Yeah.
But I don't get the impression that she's frightened in any way, as my friend Roberta was. So are there changes within the Catholic Church now, especially with all the scandals there have been?
Yes, my sense is, I mean, when I was at school taught by nuns, they were all in, veils and long habits and so on. And I was absolutely stunned when my mother died and these women came up to speak to me, and I didn't recognize them as nuns who taught me because they were now literally in plain clothes. They had hair, my goodness, hair. We didn't have any hair. And in fact, I remember one nun I thought was a man, dressed up because she was so tall and gruff. But so certainly I think within the education system, there is a greater awareness and softness, if you like. They won't get away any longer with how it used to be. As I said, I'm the eldest of 5. I've got 2 brothers, and they were taught by Christian brothers, and they hated school with a passion. And I'm sorry for Christian brothers that this is going to sound like a generalization, but by and large, they had a terrible reputation for cruelty. They were caned back to the legs and across the hands. They were made to feel, belittled. And one questioned, the kind of people who were attracted to going and joining the church. And I've certainly felt in all my adult life that Catholic priests should be allowed to marry, to have experience of life and a greater understanding of, the needs of families and children and so on. But I think it is a lot better now, and there's a greater awareness because of television, internet, and so on of these scandals and how they're not acceptable. But as I said, if we had a whiff of anything as young children, 1, we probably didn't have the language to describe what was going on, and 2, where would we have gone with it? Because the church was all powerful.
Thank you.
It's a slightly controversial question then. I read within the religious publications occasionally that the Catholic Church, rather like other churches at the moment, are in crisis, basically because there is not enough priests to go around. The amount of priests in the Protestant religion and also within the Catholic religion is so small at the moment that they're having to take on 2, 3, 4 parishes to be able to, you know, this is becoming worse as priests get older and older.
Yes, I think that would definitely be the case. I can remember growing up to be able to say you have a son a priest or a daughter a nun was, oh, I mean, gosh, that was nearly like, you know, royalty. And it was, you were encouraged to lay out that as an option to your children. In fact, one of my sister-in-laws was a nun and actually left, fell in love and got married. But she reckoned that she felt under pressure from secondary school to join the nuns. You know, had no time to enjoy romance or the world, and so felt kind of led. But I think because the world is so available and opportunities are much more available nowadays, young people are really would think long and hard before you know, joining the church. And I think the Catholic Church is definitely going to have to look at other ways of recruiting clergy and perhaps allowing married clergy. I think, I'm sure I've read somewhere that some high Anglican priests in the Church of England who have left have joined the Catholic Church and are married. So there's some precedents being set there.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm interested because someone I don't know her very well, but my husband's aunt, who I always thought of as a very thinking, sensible sort of person, she became a Catholic quite late in life. So I can only think that it wasn't as bad as it had been in your youth, as it were. It must have been a bit more enlightened, mustn't it? Otherwise, why ever did she turn to it? I couldn't make it out, really.
I hope so.
Jenny.
Right. When I was telling you about Germany, I did say that one of the children tried to commit suicide on the railway line behind our houses. He was going back to his Catholic school and didn't want to go and was terrified. So I had picked up that Catholic education wasn't heaven in any way whatsoever for young people. But the other thing I've done, I was on Avon County Council, and Mike Thomas was one of the other councillors. And when he eventually, I think in the 90s or early in the 20s, he announced that he was going to become a Roman Catholic priest. I went to the Catholic Cathedral in Bristol for the inauguration. I have never seen a pageant like it. It was absolutely amazing. You can understand why people want to belong to that. And the clothes that they wore, I mean, really over the top. And knowing Mike, I hope and I know he will be a really good Catholic priest, not like some of those you're all talking about.
Yes.
You have to change an awful lot to be like that.
I mean, you reminded me talking about the pomp and ceremony and the cloaks and so on. I mean, the church, and certainly in Rome, is very wealthy. And it's something I always had difficulty with, you know, when there's great poverty in the world. And if they sold off some of their gold and silver chalices and other accoutrements, they could fund, you know, so much poverty and further education and all sorts. Yes, I think it's what the world is crying out for is a pared back Catholic faith, going back to the New Testament, the parables, you know, about loving one another and living a simple life, and very akin to the, again, back to the testimonies in for Quakers.
Stephen.
I am still a member of your area meeting. I expect a lot of you know Sarah Pearce, who was a very long-standing and very well thought of Quaker for about 30 years, but she went over to the Catholic Church, and she was rather horrified by the degree of intolerance and anti-Catholicism that she came across from Quakers, who are supposed to be tolerant people. It seems sometimes we're more willing to be tolerant about Muslims than we are about other Christians. I hope we found that talk enlightening and enriching, and not just increasing our prejudices, because almost any person coming out of a church, whether it was evangelical, I was once an evangelical, now I'm a Quaker, or I was once a Hindu, I was once a Muslim, they would be able to tell very, very similar stories, not with all the detailed ritual perhaps that the Catholics developed, but the intolerance and the rigid thinking and the unpleasant doctrines are held by most of the religions. And we as Quakers, maybe we suffer the sin of pride, but we've got away from all that. We've got down to the heart of the religion, what's at the heart of all religions. But I think we should try and learn tolerance. And even the thing was just now said about how horrible the boarding school was. My father, who was not a Catholic, they were Anglicans, but he would tell you exactly the same stories about public schools in the 1930s and 1920s. So let's be pleased that we've found Quakerism, but not be too intolerant about people who've got other paths. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry to sound preachy, but I'm kind of speaking for Sarah, who, as you know, died last May, and she would have listened with interest to Rosalie's thing, but said, well, when I go to the church, I don't feel any of that. That doesn't affect me. I just love the depth of spiritual religion that I find there.
Well said, Stephen. Thank you for that.
David?
Yeah, just a thought, a couple of things that unite. One is that, and this is sort of on Stephen's slightly ecumenical, you said evangelical, I meant to say ecumenical theme, which is that churches are increasingly aware of the responsibility to the planet and finding links in their religions to stewardship for the planet. And that creates a basis for people to think perhaps a little bit beyond their limited faiths and to things that connect them with others. And the other thing, just an observation, I've been practicing meditation for a long time, and in South America, there are whole school systems in Ecuador and Peru, mostly Catholic schools, where the children these days all practice meditation together. So there's, sort of some hint of deep, simple but deepening spiritual practices that are themselves more neutral, more simply inward rather than outward about belief systems. So I when thinking of changes, which somebody was asking you, Rosaline, I think that's that those changes are seeping into not just Catholicism and not just Christianity, but into our world consciousness and into our faith communities. I don't know if you see that happening in the Catholic Church in this country and in Ireland.
I'm just thinking of my brothers and sisters. My youngest brother belongs to a very evangelical Protestant church, and my mother's attitude was, I don't mind which church you belong to, as long as you're going somewhere or finding some spiritual nourishment, which I thought was very broad-minded of her. And she was certainly very tolerant when I brought home an American Jew as a boyfriend at one stage, and eventually married a Protestant. But sorry, I'm saying that because my experience of yes, I'm not far away from actual practicing Catholics at the moment, that I don't really know what goes on in church. And I'm just thinking I should go along to St. Joseph's in Portishead sometime. I do represent our meeting at churches together, and I would have great respect for the Catholic deacon who attends. And I think I would say that whatever about the scandals and anything else that we know of in the Catholic Church, at the end of the day, I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't had those roots. And I felt it gave me a good basis for living my life, in a kind and caring way, and loving people, and trying to contribute to my community and all of those things. And I'd have to say, I have, of course, met some marvelous priests and nuns. Sister Colin Kill, who was the head nun of my primary school, worked really hard to get me a job after school so that I could stay on and do my leaving certificate, which is like your A levels. And she was very tolerant and gave me lots of opportunities to do things, even within the school, which built my confidence and so on. And again, Father John Wall, who set up the Peace Corps, did marvelous work in bringing the community together and giving us a good foundation for reaching out and being good neighbours and contributing to our community as well. So, I definitely don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I have maybe less ritual and more of the fundamental tenets of a faith.
I think one of the, as you mentioned something earlier on, was about the Christian Brothers who have had such poor press, of those who were the nasties of this group. And I am sure there must have been many Christian Brothers who were, as those phrase goes, the loving brothers. But unfortunately, the ones that have got all the press are those who have been abusing their position, which sadly is, the press these days sadly would focus, pardon me, would focus upon that. But sadly, friends, we have come to 12:05, where the group usually would be the ending. So,
can I just
Christopher wishes to say something. Carry on, mate.
Yeah. I will, as I said, Patsy's given me a list of the forthcoming talks, and next week we've got Jenny Smith on the next part of her life. I will circulate the list with the rest in. The two of you who I don't have email addresses from, and you said Patsy does, I'll ask her to do that.